Hello, and welcome to Obscure Laws. Tonight, we are beginning a 12-part journey into one of the strangest and most unsettling legends in modern folklore, the infamous Mothman. This will be a calm narration, so feel free to let yourself relax, maybe even drift to sleep, while you learn about this unusual and mysterious story. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from, so please share that in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into strange history and eerie lore, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Let me know in the comments which legends or stories you would like me to explore in the future. Now, let's begin. In the mid-1960s, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was the kind of small American town that rarely made headlines. Nestled where the Ohio and Kanawha rivers meet, it was quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable in most respects. The rhythm of daily life was slow and steady, with families attending church on Sundays, kids riding bicycles along tree-lined streets, and workers punching the clock in factories or driving across the old Silver Bridge to jobs in Ohio. The town was surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods, the kind of landscape that feels both comforting and isolating, depending on the mood of the day. Nothing about Point Pleasant seemed destined to host a legend, and yet, in a span of just over a year, the place became forever linked to one of the strangest and most unsettling mysteries in modern folklore. To understand why the event struck such a chord, it helps to picture the setting as it was. The mid-60s were a time of change across America, but in Point Pleasant, the atmosphere still carried a sense of small-town tradition. The Silver Bridge was a lifeline, connecting locals to Gallipolis, Ohio. The abandoned wartime munitions plant known as the TNT area was a relic of a different era, a patch of land dotted with concrete domes, overgrown brush, and stagnant ponds. Most residents paid little attention to it, though teenagers occasionally used it as a place to sneak away at night. The sense of something hidden, something left over and half forgotten, clung to that site in particular. It was a landscape ripe for stories. In November of 1966, those stories began. It was late in the evening when two young couples were driving near the TNT area. They were ordinary people, not thrill-seekers or storytellers, and by their own accounts they were not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Yet what they reported seeing changed everything. Standing on the side of the road was a figure larger than any human, with broad wings folded against its back and glowing red eyes that seemed fixed on the car. The description was simple, but chilling. It was not just the size of the thing, but the feeling it gave them, the sense that they were being watched by something unnatural. The couples claimed the creature spread its wings and took off, flying alongside their car at high speed as they tried desperately to escape. They described its wingspan as wider than the roof of the vehicle, and its movements as both smooth and impossible. When they reached the edge of town, shaken and breathless, they reported the encounter to the local police. Their story made its way into the newspapers almost immediately, and soon the town was buzzing with fear, disbelief, and curiosity. For the first time, the people of Point Pleasant had to confront the possibility that something was out there in the darkness, something that did not fit into any known category of bird or beast. The story might have died quickly if it had been a single report, but in the weeks that followed, more sightings came in. Farmers, workers, and other townsfolk began to whisper about seeing strange shapes in the night sky. Some described enormous wings beating against the moonlight. Others swore they saw red eyes staring at them from the edge of fields. What gave the accounts weight was the diversity of the witnesses. These were not all teenagers or outsiders. They were neighbors, churchgoers, and factory hands, people with no obvious reason to make up tales. Slowly, the legend began to take root. The newspapers fed the growing fascination, reporting on each new claim with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Some articles treated the creature like a curiosity, while others leaned into the fear, suggesting that something dangerous was prowling the countryside. Locals began to drive out toward the TNT area at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the thing for themselves. For many, it became a test of courage. Could you face the possibility of seeing it, those glowing eyes and dark wings rising from the brush? The TNT site, once ignored, became the stage on which the town's anxieties and curiosities played out. It is important to remember the atmosphere of the time. The 1960s carried a heavy undercurrent of unease in America. The Cold War was in full swing, and the fear of nuclear disaster lingered in every news broadcast. Strange lights in the sky were increasingly linked to talk of UFOs, which had become a nationwide obsession. People were primed to believe that the world was stranger and more threatening than it appeared. In that climate, the appearance of a winged creature in a small town did not feel as impossible as it might have in another era. Instead, it felt like one more sign that the world was slipping into the unknown. For those who claimed to see it, the creature was not just a curiosity but a source of genuine dread. Witnesses often described physical reactions they could not control. Their hands shook, their voices faltered. Some said they felt an inexplicable sense of doom, as if the creature's presence was not just physical but psychological. The glowing eyes, especially, were often recalled with trembling detail. They were not described as the reflection of light, like those of an animal, but as something that glowed from within. That detail set the Mothman apart from any ordinary bird or bat. It suggested something otherworldly, something that looked back at you with awareness. The legend spread quickly beyond Point Pleasant. Regional papers picked up the stories, and soon outsiders were arriving in town, hoping to see the creature for themselves. Amateur investigators, thrill seekers, and journalists crowded the roads near the TNT area. For a time, Point Pleasant was no longer just a quiet river town. It was the center of a mystery that seemed to belong as much to myth as to reality. The people of the town were divided. Some dismissed the sightings as nonsense, the product of hysteria and overactive imaginations. Others believed something strange was happening, though they could not agree on what it was. A few whispered about supernatural explanations, while others thought it might be a giant bird or a mutant creature living in the abandoned ruins of the TNT site. The uncertainty was part of the power of the story. With no clear answers, the imagination filled the gaps, and each new account only deepened the sense of unease. What began as a single sighting quickly became the foundation of one of the most enduring modern legends in America. Point Pleasant would never be the same. The events of 1966 marked the beginning of a chain of strange occurrences that would lead, within little more than a year, to a tragedy that bound the creature's name to the town forever. But in that first moment, it was just 4 young people driving through the night, their headlights catching a shape too large to understand, and their lives altered by what they swore they saw standing on the edge of the road. After the first report in November of 1966, Point Pleasant was never quite the same. The story of the strange winged figure with glowing red eyes spread quickly, and the town found itself at the center of something larger than it had ever known. Word of mouth carried the tale faster than newspapers could print it, and soon neighbors were whispering to one another in grocery store aisles. Children were daring each other to sneak out at night, and the quiet of the town felt punctured by the possibility of something unseen. What made the story take root so firmly was not just the shock of that initial encounter, but the fact that it was not alone. Within days, other residents came forward with their own accounts, and the descriptions were eerily similar. A tall figure, broad wings, and most unsettling of all, eyes that glowed in the dark like 2 burning coals. One local man, driving late at night, said he caught sight of it standing in a field, and that when his headlights passed over it, the creature spread its wings and lifted silently into the air. He returned home shaken, telling his wife that he had never seen anything like it. The more people spoke, the more the stories multiplied. Some farmers claimed to hear unusual shrieks echoing through the hills at night, sounds too piercing and strange to belong to any bird they knew. Others swore they saw the creature perched near barns or fence posts, watching silently before vanishing into the darkness. The detail of the glowing eyes became a constant, mentioned so often that it began to overshadow other features. To many, those eyes became the defining marker of the thing people were beginning to call the Mothman. Local law enforcement faced a difficult situation. On one hand, they could not ignore the growing number of reports. On the other, they had little evidence to go on. Officers investigated the TNT area after the first sighting, combing through the overgrown grounds of the abandoned munitions plant. They found tracks in the mud, larger than human and oddly shaped, though skeptics dismissed them as animal prints distorted by rain and erosion. Still, the tracks were enough to unsettle the officers who saw them. They had come prepared to reassure the town, but instead they left with questions they could not answer. The TNT area itself became almost as famous as the creature. Built during World War II, it had once been a bustling site of explosives manufacturing. After the war, the land was left abandoned, and nature slowly reclaimed it. Trees and weeds grew up around the concrete domes, which were nicknamed igloos by locals. Ponds filled with stagnant water reflected the moonlight in unsettling ways, and the silence of the place gave it an eerie presence. It was easy to imagine a creature hiding among the ruins. The setting seemed almost designed for a legend to take shape. By late November, the newspapers had begun reporting on what they called the Mothman, a name that stuck. The choice of words made the creature feel like something out of a comic book, yet the fear in the town was real. People avoided driving alone at night. Families locked doors more carefully than before. Hunters spoke of seeing shadows moving between the trees, and fishermen claimed strange shapes disturbed the waters of the river. It was as if the whole region had fallen under a shadow of unease. What unsettled people most was the unpredictability. The Mothman did not appear on a schedule, and it did not seem tied to one specific place. It was spotted near the TNT area, but also on rural roads, in fields, and even close to town. One woman, hanging laundry in her yard during the day, swore she saw it crouched on a rooftop across the street. She described its body as bulky, like a man's, but with wings that folded in unnerving ways. The creature leapt into the air and vanished before she could cry out. Her account was one of many that made people realize this was not only a night terror, it could appear in broad daylight. The community began to split between believers and skeptics. Some residents insisted the sightings were nothing more than owls or sandhill cranes, their size exaggerated by fear and poor lighting. Others were convinced something truly out of the ordinary was happening. The debates filled coffee shops, living rooms, and church gatherings. The legend was no longer just a story in the paper. It had become part of everyday conversation, a subject everyone had an opinion about whether they wanted to or not. As the weeks turned into December, the sightings continued, and the atmosphere of the town grew heavier. More than fear, there was a sense of anticipation, as though people were waiting for something to happen. The Mothman was rarely described as attacking anyone directly, but its presence carried with it a feeling of dread. Witnesses spoke not only of what they saw, but of what they felt. Some described a chill, others a sensation of paralysis, as though the creature's gaze alone held them in place. Whether real or imagined, these accounts deepened the mystery. The police tried to maintain calm, but their own unease sometimes slipped through. One officer admitted privately that he did not like patrolling the TNT area anymore. The place felt alive in a way he could not explain. Another claimed he heard something moving in the brush while investigating, though nothing appeared when he shined his flashlight. Stories like these circulated quietly, reinforcing the idea that even the authorities were not immune to the strangeness that had taken hold of the town. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect was how ordinary life tried to continue alongside the mounting fear. Children still went to school, shops still opened each morning, and families still attended Christmas services. Yet beneath the surface, everyone was aware of the tension. People glanced over their shoulders more often. Drivers checked their mirrors nervously at night. The Mothman had become part of the town's reality, shaping behavior even when it was not seen. The phenomenon was not confined to Point Pleasant alone. Reports trickled in from surrounding areas, with residents of nearby towns claiming strange winged figures had been spotted in the skies. This spread gave the story an even greater weight. If it was only happening in one place, perhaps it could be dismissed as hysteria. But when people miles away began telling similar stories, the sense grew that something larger was unfolding. By the end of 1966, Point Pleasant was no longer simply a quiet riverside community. It was a place where the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary had blurred. The Mothman was more than a rumor. It was a presence felt in the way people spoke, the way they moved, the way they hesitated at nightfall. The town was caught in the grip of a mystery that refused to fade, and no one knew what the next encounter would bring. As the calendar turned to the early months of 1967, the tension in Point Pleasant only deepened. The sightings had not slowed after the first chaotic weeks. Instead, they continued, irregular and unpredictable, each one adding another layer of unease. By then, the Mothman was no longer just a curiosity in the newspaper. It was a subject people could not avoid, whether they believed in it or not. The creature had become woven into the daily life of the town, shaping behavior, conversations, and even the way people viewed their once familiar surroundings. Ordinary places began to feel haunted. A quiet field where children once played now seemed threatening after dark. A dirt road winding past the river looked different in the beam of headlights, every shadow hinting at wings. The abandoned TNT area became the center of countless stories, each one more unsettling than the last. Teenagers still drove out there at night, more for the thrill of fear than a genuine belief they would see the creature, but sometimes they returned pale and trembling, swearing that something had followed them home. These stories spread quickly, and each new account blurred the line between what was real and what was imagined. The descriptions of the creature remained surprisingly consistent. Witnesses spoke of a figure taller than any man, broad-shouldered with wings that unfolded like a massive curtain. The glowing eyes were always mentioned, round and red, as if burning from within. Some claimed they reflected car headlights, but others insisted they had a light of their own, unnatural and piercing. What stood out in many accounts was not only what people saw, but how they felt. Witnesses often described being overcome with an unshakable dread, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The creature was not only visual but atmospheric, leaving behind an impression that lingered long after it disappeared. The local press continued to cover the phenomenon, and soon reporters from outside the region arrived to see what was happening in Point Pleasant. This attention brought a strange mix of pride and anxiety to the town. On one hand, it was unusual for such a small community to make headlines. On the other, no one wanted their home to be seen as a place of hysteria or ridicule. Residents found themselves caught between curiosity and embarrassment, torn between wanting answers and wishing the whole thing would fade away. The flood of stories, however, made it impossible to ignore. A group of grave diggers reported seeing a dark figure with wings glide silently over their heads in a rural cemetery. A young woman told of being chased by something flying low to the ground as she drove home late at night. Families claimed they heard screams from the woods, sounds so sharp and unnatural that even dogs whined and refused to go outside. In each case, the details differed slightly, but the core was always the same. Something with wings, something larger than expected, something that carried with it a sense of menace. Skeptics tried to calm the fear. They suggested the sightings were nothing more than large birds, particularly sandhill cranes or owls, their size distorted by fear and poor lighting. A crane standing tall with its wings spread could look enormous in the dark, and its eyes would glow red when caught in headlights. Some residents accepted this explanation, eager to believe that nothing stranger was happening. But for those who had seen the creature up close, the bird theory rang hollow. They insisted the wings were too wide, the body too large, the presence too powerful to dismiss so easily. The growing divide between believers and skeptics only added to the tension in town. Friends argued over it. Families disagreed at dinner tables. Some mocked the reports, while others whispered them in hushed tones, unwilling to risk ridicule but unable to deny their fear. The Mothman had become a mirror for deeper anxieties, reflecting not just the possibility of a monster but the uncertainty of the times. In a world already unsettled by Cold War fears, the idea of something inexplicable living just beyond the edges of the familiar felt disturbingly plausible. The more the sightings piled up, the more they began to change the behavior of the community. People stopped going out at night, unless absolutely necessary. Cars were driven in groups rather than alone, with drivers and passengers scanning the tree lines nervously. Hunters grew reluctant to enter the woods, worried that something other than deer might be waiting among the shadows. Even ordinary chores, like feeding livestock after sunset, carried an edge of unease. Life in Point Pleasant had taken on a rhythm of caution, as if everyone was waiting for the next sighting, the next piece of proof that something unexplainable was in their midst. At the same time, curiosity kept pulling people back to the TNT area. It became a strange sort of gathering place, where locals and outsiders alike parked their cars and waited in the dark, watching for movement. The abandoned concrete domes loomed like silent witnesses, their reflections in the stagnant ponds adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Some swore they saw shadows flit across the water, others claimed to hear wings brushing the air above them. Whether anything was truly there or not, the setting amplified fear, turning silence into menace and darkness into presence. The newspapers began to describe Point Pleasant as a town under siege by its own legend. Each headline brought more attention, more visitors, and more pressure on the residents. For those who had seen the creature, the coverage was both validating and frustrating. They wanted to be believed, but they also wanted answers, and with each passing week, those answers seemed further away. The creature remained elusive, appearing when it chose and leaving no trace behind except for the stories of those who claimed to encounter it. What struck many was the strange consistency of the emotional reaction. Even among witnesses who differed in their descriptions, nearly all spoke of the same feeling, a wave of dread, heavy and unshakable, that came with the sight of the glowing eyes. This sense of impending disaster became one of the defining features of the Mothman legend. It was not just a creature to be seen, but an omen to be felt, a presence that seemed to carry warnings of something yet to come. By the spring of 1967, the Mothman had become inseparable from Point Pleasant. The town was no longer just a place on the map, but a story, a mystery, a legend. It drew outsiders eager for a glimpse and left locals torn between skepticism and fear. What began as a single encounter on a lonely road had become a phenomenon shaping an entire community. And though no one knew it at the time, the shadow of the Mothman was moving toward a tragedy that would forever bind its name to the town's history. The abandoned munitions site outside of Point Pleasant, known locally as the TNT area, became the stage for some of the most unsettling accounts in the Mothman story. On its surface, it was simply a leftover from a past era, a stretch of land marked by crumbling roads, decaying concrete igloos, and overgrown brush. But for the people of Point Pleasant, the place carried an atmosphere that was difficult to explain. Even before the sightings began, it had a reputation for being strange, a place where hunters and hikers rarely lingered after dark. When the creature appeared, the TNT area became inseparable from the legend, as if the land itself was complicit in the mystery. The history of the site added to its aura. During the Second World War, the government had built a sprawling complex there to manufacture explosives. Dozens of squat concrete domes, built to contain volatile materials, were scattered across the grounds. The area was connected by dirt roads that cut through thick woods, with artificial ponds dug to provide water for the plant. When the war ended, the site was abandoned, and nature began to reclaim it. Trees crept back across the clearings, vines overtook the buildings, and the ponds filled with stagnant water and thick algae. To anyone visiting in the 1960s, it looked like a half-forgotten ruin, an industrial ghost town in the middle of the countryside. Teenagers from Point Pleasant had long used the TNT area as a hangout. Its isolation meant privacy, a place where they could park cars and escape the eyes of parents and neighbors. But even they admitted the place carried a strange presence. The air seemed heavier, the silence broken only by the hum of insects or the sudden splash of something in the ponds. Some of the old igloos still stood intact, their concrete walls cool and damp, echoing with the sound of footsteps. Others had crumbled, leaving jagged remains hidden beneath weeds. The entire landscape felt like a stage set for the uncanny, and when the Mothman appeared, the connection seemed inevitable. Witnesses often described their most frightening encounters in or near the TNT area. The couples who first reported the creature had driven past its boundaries that night in November, and many of the following sightings were clustered around the same stretch of land. Drivers spoke of shapes rising suddenly from the road, blocking their way before vanishing into the tree line. Hunters claimed they found animal carcasses scattered in ways that seemed unnatural, as though something had dragged them into the open and left them behind. Some residents even said the ponds themselves seemed alive, disturbed by movements that suggested something large just beneath the surface. For many locals, the TNT area became the physical home of the Mothman. It was where people went when they wanted to test their courage, daring each other to drive into the darkness and wait. It was where investigators and reporters parked their cars, hoping to glimpse the creature in the beams of their headlights. And it was where many said the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary seemed thinnest. Whether or not anything was truly there, the TNT site became the canvas for the town's fears. Descriptions of encounters there often carried the same unsettling detail: silence before the appearance. People spoke of sudden lulls in the noise of the night, when the crickets and frogs seemed to go quiet, leaving only stillness. In that silence, the creature would emerge, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its wings unfolding with a sound that some described as a heavy rustle and others as a low hum. Witnesses said it did not always move toward them but simply stood, watching, before taking off with impossible speed. These stories emphasized the atmosphere as much as the creature itself, suggesting that the land and the legend were intertwined. Some speculated that the TNT area's history had something to do with the sightings. The chemicals once stored there, the contaminated water, the abandoned buildings, all of it fed into rumors that the creature might be a mutation, something born from human industry and neglect. Others leaned towards supernatural explanations, seeing the place as cursed ground where something beyond nature lingered. Whatever the cause, the TNT site became inseparable from the image of Mothman, as though the creature belonged to the ruins, a guardian or prisoner of that strange stretch of land. Investigators who visited often noted the unsettling geography. The igloos were spread out in a way that made the place feel like a labyrinth, easy to get lost in after dark. The ponds reflected light in eerie patterns, and the trees pressed close to the roads, creating shadows that swallowed headlights. To walk there at night was to feel watched, even when no creature appeared. For locals, these sensations were more than imagination. They were proof that something lived there, something that revealed itself only to those who dared to intrude. As the stories spread, the TNT area became infamous beyond Point Pleasant. Newspapers and magazines described it as the lair of the Mothman, and soon outsiders arrived to see for themselves. Cars from neighboring towns lined the dirt roads on weekends, their occupants peering nervously into the darkness. For some, it was entertainment, a chance to be part of a story that was capturing national attention. For others, it was a genuine attempt to understand what was happening in this quiet corner of West Virginia. Either way, the TNT site drew people like a magnet, each visitor hoping to glimpse something they could not explain. The fascination with the area also reflected a deeper truth. Humans often tie their fears to specific landscapes. A haunted house, a dark forest, an abandoned factory, these are places where the ordinary rules of safety and familiarity seem suspended. The TNT site embodied that perfectly. It was not only the setting for the Mothman legend, but also a symbol of it, a place where history, decay, and fear blended into something larger than themselves. The creature might have been sighted elsewhere, but in the public imagination, the TNT area was its home. By the spring of 1967, the connection was cemented. To speak of the Mothman was to speak of the TNT site. The two were inseparable, each amplifying the other. The abandoned plant gave the legend a setting, and the sightings gave the land a reputation that would never fade. Even decades later, when the igloos were little more than relics and the ponds had grown quiet, the association remained. Visitors still came to walk the cracked roads and peer into the shadows, half expecting to see two red eyes glowing in the dark. In those early months, however, the sense of dread was growing. The TNT site was no longer just abandoned land. It had become a place of pilgrimage for those drawn to the mystery, and a place of fear for those who lived nearby. It was where the line between the known and the unknown seemed to blur most clearly, where the ordinary countryside of West Virginia gave way to something uncanny. For the people of Point Pleasant, the TNT area was no longer simply part of the landscape. It was the heart of a legend, and it carried with it a feeling that something larger was unfolding, something the town could neither understand nor escape. As the winter of 1966 gave way to the new year, the legend of the Mothman began to expand in ways no one in Point Pleasant had expected. What had started as a strange sighting of a winged creature near the old TNT site grew into something more complicated, more unnerving. People began to report not only the figure with glowing eyes but also lights in the sky, strange orbs that hovered silently, shifting in color and size. These lights were not always directly linked to the Mothman itself, but they appeared often enough around the same time and place that the two became tangled together in the minds of locals. The first of these accounts came from families living along the outskirts of town, people who were used to quiet nights filled only with the sounds of frogs and crickets. They described glowing spheres drifting above tree lines, sometimes lingering for several minutes before darting away with unnatural speed. The lights were too bright to be lanterns or headlights and too erratic to be airplanes. Residents who saw them were left unsettled, unsure whether they were looking at something natural, man-made, or entirely outside of human understanding. One man, driving along a rural road late at night, claimed he saw a glowing orb hovering above a field. As he slowed his car, he realized the light was not stationary but moving in slow, deliberate arcs. He watched it for nearly a minute before it rose higher, flickered, and then vanished into the night sky. He returned home shaken, telling his neighbors that he felt as if he had been observed by something far beyond his comprehension. The detail of feeling watched became a theme in many of these accounts, as if the lights themselves carried intent. Not long after, others began linking the strange lights with the presence of the Mothman. Some claimed they saw the creature in the same vicinity as the orbs, its red eyes reflecting or glowing beneath the drifting lights. Others said they saw the Mothman itself illuminated by the glow, its massive form revealed for a fleeting moment before the night swallowed it again. Whether these events were connected or not, the stories began to blur, weaving together into a tapestry of mystery that was larger than any single sighting. This blending of phenomena unsettled the town even more. People who had already been nervous about a winged creature now had to contend with the possibility of something happening in the skies above them. The fear grew layered and complex, no longer confined to the woods or the abandoned TNT site, but extending into the air itself. If the Mothman had once been a creature that could be avoided by staying home at night, the lights suggested a wider reach, something that could not be escaped so easily. The newspapers took notice of these new reports and began framing the events in the language of unidentified flying objects. The 1960s were already a time when UFO stories circulated widely across the country. The Cold War atmosphere and the space race had primed people to think about the skies in new ways, and mysterious lights were often interpreted as signs of extraterrestrial visitors. When such accounts reached Point Pleasant, they added a layer of strangeness to the ongoing story. Some residents began to wonder whether the Mothman itself was not simply a creature of the earth, but connected to something otherworldly. This interpretation divided the town. Skeptics grew louder, arguing that the hysteria was spreading too far, that now every unusual sound or light was being tied to the Mothman, whether it made sense or not. They pointed out that planes, satellites, and even car headlights, reflecting off low clouds, could create unusual effects. Believers, however, countered with the consistency of the accounts, insisting that too many people were describing the same eerie glow for it to be dismissed so easily. The debate mirrored the larger cultural split of the era, between a desire to explain everything with science and a willingness to accept that some things might lie beyond it. For those who saw the lights firsthand, explanations mattered little. The experience itself was enough to unsettle them. Many described physical reactions, racing hearts, shallow breathing, and a sense of paralysis. One woman said she was unable to move as a glowing sphere drifted silently over her house, passing so low that it illuminated her yard like a floodlight. When it moved on, she collapsed to the floor, convinced she had been spared from something dangerous. Such accounts carried a raw honesty, the kind that made them difficult to dismiss entirely. The combination of the Mothman and the strange lights also fueled talk of omens. Some locals began to wonder if the sightings were warnings, signs that something catastrophic was approaching. The town had already been living with a sense of dread from the creature itself, described so often as accompanied by a feeling of impending doom. The lights seemed to magnify that unease, turning the fear from something localized to something cosmic. It was no longer just about a winged figure in the woods. It was about forces that felt larger than human life. In the midst of this, the TNT area continued to draw attention. Many of the lights were reported in its vicinity, hovering above the ruins or gliding across the ponds. This strengthened the idea that the place was a kind of center for the phenomena, a magnet for whatever strangeness was taking hold of Point Pleasant. Visitors who dared to drive out there at night often claimed to see flashes of light or strange glows just beyond the trees, though skeptics insisted these were tricks of the eye. Regardless of the cause, the site's reputation grew, cementing its place as the heart of the mystery. By the spring of 1967, the Mothman legend was no longer just about a creature. It was about a series of interconnected experiences, figures with wings, glowing eyes, strange lights, and unexplainable feelings of dread. The town found itself caught in a story that seemed to grow larger with each telling, drawing in outsiders, investigators, and thrill-seekers. What had begun as a few frightened witnesses on a lonely road had become a phenomenon that seemed to defy categories. Was it a monster, a spirit, a visitor from beyond, or something born of fear itself? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. For the residents, the practical reality was the same. Each night carried the possibility of another sighting, another inexplicable event. Families locked their doors, drivers kept their eyes on the skies, and conversations carried the weight of uncertainty. The Mothman was no longer just a figure in the shadows. It had become part of a larger mystery, one that seemed to extend beyond the edges of Point Pleasant itself. And as the story spread, so too did the feeling that the town was caught in the grip of something far bigger than anyone could yet understand. As if the winged creature and the strange lights in the sky were not enough, another layer of mystery began to fold itself around Point Pleasant. People who reported their sightings, whether of the Mothman or the glowing orbs, soon began to speak of unusual visitors. These figures were not described as monsters or glowing apparitions, but as men. Men who appeared suddenly, asked questions no one expected, and left behind a cloud of unease that lingered just as heavily as the red-eyed figure in the woods. The townspeople began calling them men in black, and their presence added a new kind of fear, one rooted not in the unknown of the forest, but in the unsettling presence of human strangeness. The first accounts were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A man who had written to a local newspaper about the Mothman claimed that shortly afterward, two strangers in dark suits arrived at his house. They spoke in a manner he described as flat and rehearsed, asking about his report and encouraging him not to share too much more. He noted that their speech seemed odd, almost as if they did not understand the natural rhythms of conversation. When they left, he realized he never saw a car or any sign of how they had arrived. The story might have sounded paranoid if it stood alone, but it did not. Others soon claimed similar experiences. A woman who reported seeing the Mothman near her home told friends that she was visited by a man who claimed to be from a government agency. He asked pointed questions about her sighting, taking notes in a small black book. When she asked to see his identification, he brushed the request aside and abruptly ended the conversation. She later noticed that his questions seemed less about what she had seen and more about whether she planned to talk further about it. His manner was polite but unnerving, leaving her with the impression that he wanted her to be quiet. Stories like these began to ripple through the community. People whispered about strange cars parked outside their homes, black sedans with tinted windows that idled silently on quiet roads. Others spoke of telephone calls where the line went dead after a voice gave only a few strange words. The experiences did not always match in detail, but the theme was consistent. Those who spoke of the Mothman or the lights often felt they were being watched, pressured, or subtly warned not to share what they knew. The men in black, as they came to be called, seemed almost as frightening as the creature itself. Unlike the Mothman, they did not appear in sudden bursts of terror, glowing eyes and rushing wings. Instead, they slipped into the fabric of ordinary life, knocks at the door, strangers asking questions, cars appearing on roads where no one else traveled. Their presence blurred the boundary between the mystery of the skies and the authority of human power. Were they government agents sent to investigate, or something else entirely, mimicking human form but never quite getting it right? Witnesses often described their appearance in unsettling detail. The men were usually dressed in black suits that seemed outdated or ill-fitting. Their skin was described as pale, sometimes unnaturally so, and their speech was often awkward, as though they were imitating human interaction rather than experiencing it naturally. Some claimed the men asked questions about ordinary objects in the house, appearing fascinated by things like pens or kitchen appliances. These odd details only deepened the strangeness, suggesting that the visitors were not simply officials gathering information but something far less understandable. For Point Pleasant, already weighed down by fear of the Mothman, these encounters added another layer of paranoia. It was one thing to fear a creature in the woods, another entirely to feel that human figures were trying to silence the town. Families became more cautious about speaking to reporters, and some who had originally shared their stories now chose to remain quiet. The effect was chilling. The legend was growing, but it was accompanied by an atmosphere of suspicion, as though the very act of talking about it could draw unwanted attention. The presence of the men in black also tied the local events to broader fears of the era. Across the country, people were already suspicious of government secrecy, especially during the Cold War. Stories of UFOs often came with rumors of agents who appeared to confiscate evidence or discourage witnesses. In Point Pleasant, those wider anxieties found a home. The Mothman was not only a local legend but part of a larger web of mystery, one that suggested forces far beyond the Ohio River were at play. Whether real or imagined, the stories of the men in black spread quickly. For many residents, they became another reason to remain silent. Why risk the appearance of strangers at your doorstep simply for admitting you saw something you could not explain? The fear of ridicule was already strong. The fear of being watched made it stronger. Some who had planned to share their stories with newspapers chose instead to keep them private, telling only close friends in whispers. The silence itself became part of the legend, an invisible pressure shaping what was said and what was left unsaid. The contrast between the two sides of the mystery, creature and men, was striking. The Mothman inspired fear through presence, glowing eyes in the night and wings spread wide in the darkness. The men in black inspired fear through absence, through their silence, their vague questions, and their ability to appear and vanish without explanation. One was the terror of nature or the supernatural. The other was the terror of secrecy and control. Together, they made Point Pleasant a place where no one could feel at ease. By the summer of 1967, the town was caught in a tightening web. The Mothman sightings continued, the lights in the sky were still reported, and now people felt the added weight of being observed. The streets of the town looked ordinary, but beneath the surface, conversations were hushed, glances were wary, and many people felt the uneasy sense that something larger than themselves was unfolding. The men in black had become part of the story, inseparable from the legend of the Mothman itself, and for many residents, that was the most disturbing development of all. The ordinary routines of life went on, but they were shadowed by fear. Farmers still worked their fields, children still played outside, and families still attended church, yet the air carried an unspoken tension. Every knock at the door after dark brought unease. Every strange car seen on a back road stirred suspicion. The Mothman had made Point Pleasant look to the skies and to the woods, but the men in black made people look over their shoulders, wondering who was listening and why. In the end, the creature and the men seemed bound together, each amplifying the other. The Mothman was the face of dread, the visible symbol of something inexplicable. The men in black were the shadow, the invisible hand suggesting that whatever was happening was not only real but dangerous to talk about. For Point Pleasant, that combination was suffocating. Fear of the unknown was joined by fear of authority, leaving the town suspended in uncertainty, waiting for something to break. And though no one yet knew it, the breaking point was coming, and it would arrive with tragedy. By December of 1967, the town of Point Pleasant had lived with fear for over a year. The Mothman had become part of the rhythm of life. With sightings whispered in kitchens and printed in newspapers, its glowing eyes still haunting the roads near the TNT area. Strange lights had drifted across the skies, and visitors dressed in black had left residents uneasy with their quiet warnings. The town felt suspended in a fog of dread, as though something was building, something that could not be avoided. That tension broke on the 15th of December, when the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people and forever binding the name of the Mothman to tragedy. The Silver Bridge was not just a structure of steel and rivets, it was a lifeline connecting Point Pleasant in West Virginia to Gallipolis in Ohio. Every day, hundreds of cars and trucks crossed its span, carrying workers, families, and goods back and forth. Built in the 1920s, it had served the region for decades, and while some locals occasionally grumbled about its age, few believed it was truly unsafe. On that cold December day, however, the bridge revealed the cost of its years, and the result was catastrophic. It was late afternoon, and traffic on the bridge was heavy with shoppers heading home for the holidays. Many were returning from buying gifts and groceries, preparing for Christmas just 10 days away. Drivers described the usual hum of cars lined bumper to bumper, the river below glinting in the pale winter light. Then, with no warning, a sound like the crack of thunder echoed through the air. A single link in the suspension chain gave way, and in a matter of seconds, the entire structure began to twist and fall. Witnesses recalled the terrifying sight of steel beams snapping like twigs, the roadway breaking apart beneath their tires. Cars plunged into the freezing water of the Ohio River, while others were crushed by falling debris. Some survivors managed to escape through shattered windows, swimming to the surface in the chaos, while others were trapped as vehicles sank quickly into the depths. The collapse was over in less than a minute, but the devastation it left was almost unimaginable. The news spread instantly through Point Pleasant. Sirens wailed as ambulances and fire trucks rushed to the scene, and families ran to the riverbanks desperate for news of loved ones. The sight that greeted them was one of horror: twisted steel jutting out of the water, vehicles half submerged, rescue crews pulling bodies and survivors from the icy current. In total, 46 lives were lost, and 9 bodies were never recovered. The town was plunged into grief, its holiday season forever marked by tragedy. For many, the collapse of the Silver Bridge was a devastating accident, the kind that reshapes a community for generations. Engineers later explained that the failure had been caused by a single eye-bar in the suspension chain, a small defect that had grown over decades until the weight of rush-hour traffic became too much. But for the residents of Point Pleasant, who had lived for months under the shadow of the Mothman, the disaster felt like something more. It felt like the fulfillment of the dread that had haunted the town since the first sighting of glowing eyes in the woods. Almost immediately, whispers spread that the Mothman had been seen near the bridge before its collapse. Some claimed it perched on the steel beams in the days leading up to the disaster, its wings folded as it watched silently. Others said it had been seen flying overhead, a dark silhouette against the winter sky. Whether these reports were real or shaped by grief, they added fuel to the belief that the Mothman was not just a creature but an omen, a harbinger of catastrophe. For those who had described the feeling of doom that accompanied the sightings, the collapse seemed to confirm their fears. The dread had been real, they insisted, and the bridge disaster was the event they had been sensing all along. To them, the Mothman was not the cause of the tragedy, but the warning. It had appeared to alert the town, even if the meaning of its presence had not been understood in time. This interpretation gave the legend a new dimension, transforming the creature from monster to messenger. Others disagreed, arguing that linking the Mothman to the bridge collapse was an act of desperation, an attempt to make sense of a senseless event. The tragedy, they said, was the result of engineering failure, nothing more. To tie it to glowing eyes and wings in the night was to cheapen the real grief of those who had lost loved ones. Yet even among skeptics, the timing was difficult to ignore: the year of fear, the mounting unease, the strange lights, and then, at the peak of it all, the worst disaster the town had ever seen. In the days after the collapse, Point Pleasant was overwhelmed by mourning. Funerals were held one after another, with entire families grieving side by side. The town was small enough that almost everyone knew someone who had been on the bridge that day. Some lost parents, others children, and many lost friends. The holiday season became a season of grief, the Christmas lights dimmed by sorrow. The image of the twisted bridge remained etched in memory, a wound that would not heal quickly. At the same time, the legend of the Mothman reached its peak. National newspapers and television crews arrived to cover the disaster, and with them came questions about the strange stories that had circulated for over a year. Reporters asked locals about the creature, the lights, and the men in black. The combination of tragedy and mystery made for a story that spread far beyond West Virginia, capturing the attention of the entire country. For Point Pleasant, it was a strange double blow, the pain of genuine loss and the sudden glare of sensational attention. In the years that followed, the Mothman became inseparable from the memory of the Silver Bridge. Even as investigators confirmed the technical cause of the collapse, many locals continued to believe that the creature had played a role. For some, it was a curse. For others, a warning. For nearly everyone, it was impossible to separate the two events. The Mothman legend had begun with glowing eyes near an abandoned munitions plant, but it became something far larger on the day the bridge fell. The collapse marked a turning point. After December 15th, reports of the Mothman all but ceased. It was as if the creature had vanished, its purpose fulfilled or its presence no longer needed. Some saw this as proof that it had been tied to the disaster all along, its appearances building toward that single event. Others suggested that fear and grief had shifted the town's focus, leaving little room for stories of red eyes and wings. Whatever the explanation, the silence was as eerie as the sightings themselves. For Point Pleasant, the legend was now permanent. The Mothman was not just a strange creature in the woods. It was part of the town's history, linked forever to a night of tragedy. The Silver Bridge collapse left scars that could not be erased, and alongside those scars grew a story that would travel far beyond the Ohio River Valley. The town had lost 46 lives, but it had also gained a legend that would ensure it was never forgotten. The collapse of the Silver Bridge left Point Pleasant in a state of mourning that was hard to describe to outsiders. A town that had lived with whispers of glowing eyes and wings was suddenly struck by a very real tragedy, one that claimed dozens of lives and left families shattered just as the holiday season was meant to bring them together. The grief was overwhelming. Streets that had once been filled with Christmas lights now glowed dimly, if at all, as families focused instead on funerals and the long process of rebuilding their lives. In those dark weeks after December 15th, the atmosphere of Point Pleasant was heavy with sorrow. Funerals were held one after another, sometimes several in the same day. The church bells tolled so often that people began to lose track of which service was for which family. The smallness of the town made the grief communal. Everyone knew someone who had been on the bridge that day. Some lost fathers and mothers. Others lost siblings, friends, or co-workers. Children were left without parents, and parents buried their children. There was no household untouched by the collapse. Alongside the grief, however, came the strange persistence of the legend. For over a year, residents had spoken in hushed tones about the Mothman. They had described the dread that accompanied its glowing eyes, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Now, in the aftermath of the disaster, many were convinced that the creature had been an omen, a warning that no one had understood in time. Conversations about the collapse often turned quickly to the legend. Had anyone seen the creature on the bridge? Did the sighting stop because its purpose had been fulfilled? Was the town cursed, or had it been given a chance to prepare for something it could not escape? These questions lingered in homes and on street corners, whispered in grocery stores and spoken openly in taverns. Even those who had once dismissed the Mothman reports as hysteria now found themselves wondering. The timing was too unsettling to ignore. A year of fear, then the worst disaster in the town's history. The connection seemed undeniable to many. Newspapers and television stations descended on Point Pleasant to cover the story, and with them came a flood of curiosity about the legend. Reporters who came to write about the collapse often left with notes about glowing eyes and strange lights in the sky. For the people of Point Pleasant, this attention was uncomfortable. They were mourning real losses, yet outsiders seemed just as interested in the supernatural side of the story. Some residents resented the way the tragedy was being tied to tales of a monster. Others leaned into it, convinced that the truth of what had happened could not be separated from the sightings that had haunted the town for months. What was most striking was the way the sightings ceased after the collapse. For over a year, the Mothman had appeared regularly, reported by farmers, drivers, and families alike. But once the Silver Bridge fell, the creature seemed to vanish. No more glowing eyes were spotted in the woods. No more wings rose from the road at night. The The silence was eerie, and for many, it was the final piece of proof that the creature's presence had been tied directly to the disaster. It had appeared to warn of catastrophe, and once the catastrophe came, it was gone. For those who believed in the Mothman as a harbinger, this interpretation offered a grim sense of closure. The dread they had felt, the heaviness that came with sightings, was explained. It had been the shadow of the coming collapse. Yet for others, the silence was disturbing in its own way. If the creature was truly an omen, did that mean more tragedies were to follow in other places? Was Point Pleasant merely the first community to experience its warning? Such questions added another layer of unease to a town already weighed down by grief. At the same time, skeptics pointed to the engineering reports that followed. Investigators concluded that the collapse had been caused by a tiny fracture in a suspension chain, a flaw invisible to the naked eye that had grown over decades. The defect had been waiting for the right moment, and that moment had come during the evening rush hour of December 15th. To skeptics, this explanation was enough. The collapse was tragic but entirely explainable, and the Mothman had nothing to do with it. But even they could not deny that the legend had taken on a life of its own, and no amount of technical explanation could erase the connection people now felt between the creature and the disaster. The aftermath of the collapse also transformed the Mothman from a local story into a national phenomenon. Books and articles soon followed, weaving the creature into the wider tapestry of paranormal lore. The link between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge was emphasized again and again, ensuring that the two would never be separated in popular memory. Point Pleasant, once just another riverside town, became a place whispered about far beyond West Virginia, a place where tragedy and mystery had collided in ways too strange to forget. For the residents, this new fame was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it ensured that the victims of the collapse were remembered. Their lives and losses became part of a story that reached far beyond the Ohio River Valley. On the other hand, it meant that grief was often overshadowed by speculation about monsters and omens. Families who had lost loved ones sometimes found themselves fielding questions about the Mothman instead of receiving quiet condolences. The blending of tragedy and legend left a scar that was both emotional and cultural, shaping the town's identity in ways no one had asked for. In the years immediately after the collapse, Point Pleasant carried its grief quietly. Memorials were held, and survivors tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of the Mothman lingered. Some residents swore they never wanted to hear the name again. Others found themselves unable to stop thinking about it, replaying their sightings and wondering what they had meant. The bridge disaster gave the creature a weight it had never carried before. It was no longer just a strange figure in the woods. It was a symbol of catastrophe, a reminder of how quickly life could change. As time passed, the story of the Mothman began to evolve. The creature became more than a local legend. It became a subject of fascination for researchers, writers, and believers across the country. Point Pleasant, for better or worse, became known not only for its tragedy but for its monster. And though the grief of the Silver Bridge would always remain, the legend of the Mothman gave the town a place in folklore that would endure long after the last funeral bell had stopped ringing. After the collapse of the Silver Bridge and the sudden silence of the creature's appearances in Point Pleasant, it would have been easy to believe that the Mothman belonged solely to that small town in West Virginia. The locals had endured more than a year of dread, and the disaster that followed gave the legend a weight that seemed inescapably tied to their own community. Yet in the years that followed, reports of similar winged figures began to surface in other places. The legend did not fade with the grief of Point Pleasant. Instead, it traveled, taking on new forms in new settings and giving rise to the unsettling idea that the Mothman was not bound to one town or one moment in history. One of the earliest echoes came from across the ocean, in the Soviet Union. In the late 1980s, survivors of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster claimed that workers and residents in Pripyat had seen a strange, winged figure with glowing red eyes in the days leading up to the explosion at Reactor 4. According to these accounts, the creature appeared perched on rooftops, soaring above the plant, or lurking near the structures that would soon be consumed by disaster. Some claimed that it screamed, a sound so piercing that it left them trembling. When the reactor exploded in April of 1986, the figure was said to vanish, never to be seen again. The story carried an eerie similarity to the events in Point Pleasant, suggesting that the Mothman was not just a local omen but a harbinger of catastrophe wherever it appeared. Skeptics dismissed the Chernobyl accounts as folklore shaped in hindsight, a way for survivors to find meaning in tragedy. But the resemblance to the Point Pleasant legend was difficult to ignore. Both involved a winged figure with glowing eyes, both carried with them feelings of dread, and both were linked to sudden, large-scale disaster. Whether the stories were true or not, they helped cement the idea of the Mothman as a global phenomenon, an omen tied not to geography but to calamity itself. Other accounts emerged closer to home. In the early 2000s, residents of Chicago began reporting sightings of a tall, winged creature with glowing eyes seen flying over the city at night. Some described it perched on buildings, others said they saw it gliding silently across highways, its form illuminated briefly by streetlights before vanishing into the dark. The reports came from a wide range of witnesses: drivers, construction workers, families out for evening walks. What united them was the same core description: large wings, glowing eyes, and an unshakable sense of dread. The Chicago sightings reignited interest in the Mothman, with newspapers and paranormal investigators revisiting the Point Pleasant legend to draw comparisons. Some residents began to speculate whether the city itself was in danger, whether the creature's appearance was a sign of something terrible approaching. The fear was amplified by the sheer size of Chicago, a place far larger than Point Pleasant, with millions of people who might be touched by disaster if the pattern held true. Beyond Chicago, similar stories cropped up in Mexico, Russia, and parts of Europe. In each case, the details varied slightly, shaped by local culture and the words of the witnesses, yet the core remained: a winged figure, human-like but larger, with glowing red eyes and an aura of dread. The repetition of these elements across continents suggested to some that the Mothman was not an isolated legend but a recurring archetype, a figure that surfaced wherever humanity faced catastrophe. Folklorists noted that winged omens of disaster had appeared in cultures long before Point Pleasant. In Irish tradition, the banshee was said to wail outside homes before a death. In certain Native American traditions, thunderbirds were tied to great change or upheaval. In European folklore, blackbirds were often associated with death and misfortune. The Mothman, in this sense, was not entirely new but a modern incarnation of an ancient theme: the idea that before great tragedy, the world sends a warning in the form of a creature that straddles the line between the human and the monstrous. Yet what set the Mothman apart was the consistency of its modern details. The glowing red eyes, the wide wingspan, the silent flight, all of these recurred with remarkable similarity across different witnesses and locations. That consistency made it difficult to dismiss entirely as coincidence or imagination. How could so many people, across so many places, describe the same thing if there was not some truth at the heart of it? The question lingered, without any clear answers. For those who lived through the events in Point Pleasant, hearing of these new sightings was unsettling. Some felt a grim validation, as though the tragedy of the Silver Bridge had not been in vain but part of a larger story that the world was beginning to understand. Others felt disturbed, unwilling to believe that the same creature that had haunted their town might appear elsewhere, carrying the same implications of doom. For them, the Mothman was not just a global omen but a personal wound, and its reappearance elsewhere reopened the grief of December 1967. As the legend spread, it also became more deeply entangled with modern culture. The creature appeared in books, documentaries, and films, its image refined into a recognizable archetype: tall, winged, with glowing eyes that burned through the darkness. This visibility ensured that new sightings were quickly compared to the original story, reinforcing the cycle. Each new report gave weight to the legend, and each retelling of the legend made new reports more likely. The Mothman had become not only a figure of folklore, but a lens through which people interpreted their fears. What stood out most in these accounts, whether in Chicago, Chernobyl, or Mexico, was not just what people saw, but what they felt. Witnesses consistently spoke of dread, of an unshakable sense that something terrible was about to happen. This emotional component gave the legend its power, elevating it from mere monster sighting to something more profound. The Mothman was not simply a creature of flesh and bone, whether real or imagined. It was a symbol of looming catastrophe, an omen that carried weight because it echoed the deepest human fear that disaster can strike without warning, and that sometimes, perhaps, we are given a glimpse of it before it comes. By the late 20th century, the Mothman had moved far beyond the borders of Point Pleasant. It had become a global legend, a harbinger of disaster that could appear anywhere, to anyone. The town that had first whispered of glowing eyes in the woods was now part of a larger tapestry, its tragedy linked by threads of fear and mystery to places around the world. The Silver Bridge collapse might have been the end of the Mothman in West Virginia, but it was only the beginning of the creature's place in global folklore. The legend of the Mothman may feel like something entirely unique to Point Pleasant, yet when you step back and look at the wider history of folklore, it becomes clear that the creature fits into a much older and far broader tradition. Across cultures and centuries, humans have told stories of winged figures, glowing eyes, and strange omens that appear in the moments before disaster. The Mothman is not an isolated phenomenon but part of a deep and recurring human pattern, the belief that the world sends warnings, often in the form of figures that straddle the line between human and something else. In Irish tradition, the banshee was said to appear before a death in the family. Unlike the Mothman, the banshee was not winged, but she was unmistakably an omen, her wails piercing the night and leaving listeners with the certainty that loss was near. Families who heard her cries knew that someone close to them would not live much longer. This sense of forewarning, tied to a figure who appeared suddenly in the dark, mirrors the dread that witnesses in Point Pleasant described. The banshee may have been a woman rather than a winged creature, but the emotional effect was the same, the collapse of the boundary between the ordinary world and the shadow of catastrophe. In Native American traditions, winged figures often carried enormous symbolic weight. The thunderbird, for instance, was described as a massive bird capable of summoning storms with the beating of its wings. Though not always an omen of tragedy, the thunderbird represented the immense power of nature, reminding humans that forces larger than themselves could shape their fate. In some variations of these stories, seeing such a bird could foreshadow change or upheaval, a theme not so different from the way the Mothman has been interpreted as a harbinger of disaster. The imagery of wings, storms, and transformation echoes through both sets of tales, linking ancient traditions to modern fear. In European folklore, black birds such as ravens and crows have long been tied to death and misfortune. A flock gathering suddenly near a home could be taken as a sign that illness or loss was imminent. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe later wove these associations into chilling images that endure to this day. In Point Pleasant, when people spoke of glowing red eyes in the dark, the natural comparison was to birds, but the details never fit. The wings were too wide, the body too tall, the eyes too alive with their own light. Yet the impulse to see wings as tied to fate and disaster is centuries old, and the Mothman carried that thread into the modern era with new force. Even in ancient Greece, omens often took the form of creatures straddling the human and the monstrous. Harpies were winged women who carried away the dead. The Furies, though not winged, appeared to those guilty of crimes, driving them to madness before death. In each case, the figure was not merely a monster but a messenger, a visible reminder that the world itself could deliver judgment and consequence. The Mothman, described as both human-like and inhuman, fits this archetype with eerie precision. What is striking is how these stories, across time and place, all share the same central idea, that disaster does not come entirely unannounced. Before catastrophe strikes, there are signs. Sometimes those signs are storms, sometimes strange lights, and sometimes figures that appear briefly in the darkness before vanishing again. The Mothman belongs to this family of warnings. The people of Point Pleasant described not just a creature but a feeling that came with it, an overwhelming dread that something was about to happen. That sensation ties directly to the way cultures have described omens for centuries. Psychologists might argue that these figures are projections of human fear, born from our need to make sense of the unknown. When disaster strikes, the human mind looks for meaning, patterns, and signs that it could have been anticipated. Stories like the Mothman give shape to that need, transforming random catastrophe into part of a larger pattern of warnings. But for the people who see them, the experience is not an abstract concept. It is visceral. It is the sound of wings in the night, the sight of eyes glowing red where no light should be, the feeling in the gut that says something terrible is near. The global accounts of the Mothman echo this idea. In Chernobyl, the winged figure seen before the reactor explosion mirrored the role of the banshee or the thunderbird. In Chicago, the glowing-eyed creature perched on rooftops fit the same pattern. Each time, witnesses were left not only with images but with emotions, fear, dread, and the certainty that disaster was close. These emotions are what give the legend its enduring power. A monster is frightening, but a messenger of doom is haunting in a deeper way, because it suggests that catastrophe is woven into the fabric of the world itself. What also connects these traditions is the sense that such figures are neither entirely evil nor entirely good. The banshee did not cause death. She announced it. The thunderbird did not necessarily bring tragedy. It embodied power and change. The Mothman, too, seems to occupy this liminal role. Was it a monster terrorizing Point Pleasant, or was it a warning that the bridge was doomed to collapse? Witnesses struggled with this question, and decades later, it remains unanswered. The ambiguity itself is what makes the legend so enduring. It resists categorization, hovering like its wings over the boundary between harm and help, fear and foresight. In folklore, this ambiguity is common. Figures that exist on the edge of humanity often carry messages that are difficult to interpret. They may frighten us, but they may also be trying to prepare us. The Mothman, with its glowing eyes and silent wings, carries that same duality. For those who saw it in Point Pleasant, it was terrifying, but in hindsight, many came to believe it was a messenger rather than a predator. This reinterpretation shows how legends adapt, how people use them to make sense of what feels senseless. The connection between the Mothman and older omens also helps explain why the legend spread so easily beyond Point Pleasant. When people in other countries reported seeing similar figures before disasters, they were not simply copying an American story. They were tapping into a universal human pattern, one that has existed for centuries. The details may differ, wings in one culture, cries in another, but the message is the same. Before tragedy, there are signs, and sometimes those signs take the shape of figures that terrify us. By the time the Mothman entered popular culture through books and films, it had already joined this long tradition of omens. Its red eyes and wings were not just frightening images, but symbols tied to something deeper, something that resonates with human beings across generations and continents. The Mothman is not merely a cryptid or a monster. It is part of a lineage of stories that remind us of our fragility, our desire for meaning, and our fear of what waits just beyond the edge of our understanding. By the late 20th century, the story of the Mothman had expanded far beyond Point Pleasant, carried by books, documentaries, and the endless retellings of those who had lived through the events of 1966 and 1967. Yet, with the legend spreading, there also came attempts to investigate it more seriously. Researchers, skeptics, and enthusiasts descended on the town and on the wider phenomenon, each trying to decide whether the Mothman was folklore, hoax, or some unexplained reality. The results of these investigations reveal as much about human belief as they do about the creature itself. One of the first serious efforts to document the story came from authors who collected eyewitness accounts directly from residents. They interviewed the couples who had seen the creature near the TNT site, the gravediggers who described a figure flying over their heads, and the dozens of townspeople who reported glowing eyes along country roads. What stood out to them was the consistency of the descriptions. While details about size and behavior varied, the glowing red eyes and wide wingspan were nearly universal. The repetition of these features made it difficult to dismiss the stories outright. If so many people, many of them unconnected to each other, described the same thing, it suggested at least the possibility that something had been there. Skeptics, however, argued that consistency could be explained by the power of suggestion. Once a few early sightings made their way into the newspapers, later witnesses might have shaped their memories to match the reports. Memory is malleable, they reminded people, and fear can sharpen or distort perception. A tall bird glimpsed in headlights might become a towering creature when retold, especially in a town already buzzing with anxiety. To skeptics, the Mothman was not proof of a monster, but proof of how quickly human imagination can take hold. Some researchers took a more biological approach. They suggested that the Mothman was in fact a large bird, perhaps a sandhill crane or a great horned owl, both of which can appear much larger than expected in the dark. A crane standing in the road at night, its wings spread, could easily look enormous to a startled driver. Its eyes, when struck by headlights, would glow red, matching the descriptions of witnesses. An owl with an unusually wide wingspan could also give the impression of a human-like figure when seen from a distance. These explanations satisfied some, but others insisted that the sheer number of sightings and the intensity of the experiences went beyond what a bird could account for. The psychological aspect of the legend also drew attention. Some investigators argued that the Mothman reflected the anxieties of the era. The 1960s were marked by Cold War tensions, fears of nuclear conflict, and rapid social change. In that context, the appearance of a terrifying, incomprehensible creature could be seen as a projection of those collective fears. The strange lights in the sky fit neatly into the widespread fascination with UFOs, and the men in black mirrored growing suspicion of government secrecy. From this perspective, Point Pleasant had become the stage where cultural anxieties took physical form, embodied in the figure of the Mothman. Despite these rational explanations, many locals held firmly to their belief that what they had seen was real. The emotional weight of their encounters was not something they could dismiss as imagination. They spoke of the fear that gripped them, the sense of paralysis when faced with the glowing eyes, and the lingering dread that followed them home. For them, the experience was undeniable, no matter what skeptics said. The legend persisted because it was not only about what was seen, but about what was felt, and feelings are far harder to explain away than shapes in the dark. The Silver Bridge disaster remained the central anchor of the legend, and investigators wrestled with how to handle that connection. On one hand, engineers had thoroughly explained the collapse as a structural failure, unrelated to supernatural events. On the other hand, the timing was impossible to ignore. The sightings of the Mothman had ceased immediately after the disaster, leaving even some skeptics with the uneasy sense that the two were somehow linked. Whether the creature was an omen or a coincidence, the overlap ensured that the legend would never be untangled from tragedy. In the decades that followed, Point Pleasant began to embrace its role as the home of the Mothman. At first, the town carried the legend quietly, focusing instead on mourning and rebuilding. But as outsiders continued to visit, drawn by the story, residents gradually realized that the Mothman had given their small town an unusual place in cultural history. Shops began to sell Mothman memorabilia, and local tours highlighted the TNT area. Eventually, the town established a festival to celebrate the legend, drawing visitors from across the country. What had once been a source of dread slowly transformed into a symbol of identity, one that connected the town to a global audience fascinated by mystery. This transformation did not erase the seriousness of the original events. Survivors and families who lost loved ones in the Silver Bridge collapse remained sensitive to the blending of tragedy and legend. For them, the Mothman was not just folklore, but something tied to deep personal loss. At the same time, the broader community found in the legend a way to tell their story, to keep the memory of those years alive, and to attract interest to a town that might otherwise have been forgotten. In that sense, the Mothman became both a scar and a badge, a reminder of grief and a source of connection. Modern investigations into the Mothman continue to this day. Researchers and enthusiasts visit Point Pleasant regularly, walking the cracked roads of the TNT area and peering into the abandoned igloos where the creature was said to appear. Some bring cameras and equipment, hoping to capture evidence. Others simply come to experience the eerie atmosphere for themselves, drawn by the combination of history and mystery. While no definitive proof has ever been found, the persistence of interest demonstrates how deeply the story resonates. Skeptics point out that the absence of evidence after so many years suggests the Mothman was always a legend rather than a physical creature. Believers counter that the legend is larger than physical proof, that its meaning lies not in photographs or footprints, but in the shared experience of those who felt its presence. The debate has no resolution, but perhaps that is what gives the story its enduring power. If the Mothman had been conclusively proven or disproven, it might have faded into history. Instead, it remains suspended in uncertainty, a mystery that refuses to be pinned down. What is clear is that the Mothman has become more than a local cryptid. It is a cultural symbol, a modern myth that ties together fear, tragedy, and the human desire for meaning. It is studied by folklorists, written about by journalists, and retold by storytellers around the world. Its glowing red eyes have become shorthand for the uncanny, its wings a reminder that not all shadows can be explained. In that sense, the Mothman has achieved something few legends manage. It has escaped its origin and become universal. By the turn of the 21st century, the Mothman was firmly entrenched in both popular culture and scholarly curiosity. It had been explained and re-explained, debunked and defended, mourned and celebrated. Yet through all of this, the core of the legend remained unchanged. A figure seen in the darkness, carrying with it a sense of dread, appearing before disaster and vanishing just as suddenly. The Mothman had become a mirror for human fears, and that mirror showed no signs of fading. The story of the Mothman began with two couples driving through the back roads of West Virginia on a chilly night in November of 1966. They described glowing red eyes, wide wings, and a fear so intense it lingered long after the encounter. Over the course of a year, dozens of others shared similar stories, each adding to a growing sense that something extraordinary was happening in their small town. Then came the collapse of the Silver Bridge, a disaster that took 46 lives and ensured that the Mothman would never again be seen as just a local curiosity. In the decades since, the legend has grown, spreading across cultures and continents, becoming more than a cryptid and settling firmly into the world of myth. The final question, after all of this, is not whether the Mothman was real in the physical sense. That debate will never be settled. For some, it was a large bird misidentified in the dark. For others, it was a creature from another world, a messenger tied to forces beyond human understanding. For still others, it was a projection of human fear, shaped by the anxieties of the 1960s. But no matter which explanation one chooses, the fact remains that the Mothman left a permanent mark on Point Pleasant and on human imagination. Its reality lies not only in what people saw, but in what they felt, and in the stories that continue to be told. In the years since the sightings, Point Pleasant has transformed the Mothman from a shadow of dread into a symbol of identity. Each September, the town hosts a festival that draws thousands of visitors. Vendors line the streets with shirts, books, and figurines. Families pose in front of a towering statue of the creature, its wings spread wide, its eyes gleaming red in the sunlight. The festival is filled with laughter, curiosity, and celebration, a stark contrast to the fear that once gripped the town. What was once whispered in kitchens as a warning is now shouted in the open air as a point of pride. The people of Point Pleasant have taken ownership of their legend, reshaping it into something they can carry forward rather than something that weighs them down. At the same time, the memory of the Silver Bridge has not been forgotten. A memorial honors the 46 lives lost, and residents who were alive during the disaster still speak of it with quiet reverence. For them, the Mothman cannot be separated from that night of tragedy, and the legend is always tinged with grief. In this way, the town holds two truths at once, the legend as celebration and the memory as mourning. Both are valid, and both are part of the legacy that the Mothman left behind. The endurance of the Mothman legend speaks to something universal. Humans have always told stories of omens, of figures that appear in the dark before disaster strikes. These stories remind us of our vulnerability, of the way life can change in a single moment. They also give us a sense of order, suggesting that catastrophe is not entirely random, that there are signs if only we can recognize them. The Mothman fits neatly into this tradition, its glowing eyes and silent wings serving as a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than we often admit. Folklorists see in the Mothman a modern expression of ancient archetypes. Psychologists see in it a mirror of human fear. Believers see in it proof that the unknown still walks among us. Each perspective adds another layer to the story. And perhaps the truth lies in the blending of them all. The Mothman may be monster, omen, or metaphor, but in every interpretation it reveals something about us, our fears, our need for meaning, and our fascination with the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary. What makes the Mothman especially compelling is the way it resists resolution. Most legends either fade with time or are eventually explained away. The Mothman, however, remains suspended in mystery. The sightings stopped, but the questions never did. Each generation finds new meaning in the story, whether connecting it to disasters in faraway places or weaving it into new cultural contexts. The Mothman does not belong to the past. It continues to live in the present, reshaped by every retelling, given new life by every person who whispers of glowing eyes in the night. There is also something deeply human in the way Point Pleasant has embraced its legend. Rather than letting the story fade or denying it out of embarrassment, the town chose to hold on to it, to make it part of its identity. This act of ownership is powerful. It transforms fear into resilience, tragedy into memory, and mystery into connection. Visitors who come to Point Pleasant are not just chasing a monster story. They are stepping into a community that has woven its own past into a narrative that is both haunting and hopeful. The Mothman endures because it straddles so many roles at once. It is a monster, terrifying in its sudden appearances. It is an omen, tied to tragedy in ways too precise to ignore. It is a cultural symbol, a reminder that even in the modern world, mysteries remain unsolved. And it is a story, one that binds together a small town in West Virginia with people across the world who have never set foot there but feel the shiver of recognition when they hear of glowing eyes in the dark. As with all enduring legends, the truth of the Mothman may not matter as much as the impact it leaves. The creature may or may not have existed in physical form, but it existed in the lives of those who saw it, in the grief of those who connected it to tragedy, and in the imagination of everyone who has carried the story forward. That impact is real, and it ensures that the Mothman will never be forgotten. The final image is this: a town by the river, marked by sorrow yet bound together by resilience. In the woods beyond the town, the abandoned TNT site sits quietly, its concrete igloos covered in vines, its ponds reflecting the moon. Somewhere, in the imagination of the people who still visit, two red eyes may glow once more, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that life is fragile, that mysteries endure, and that sometimes, in the face of both tragedy and uncertainty, stories are what keep us going. The Mothman may never return to Point Pleasant in the way it once appeared, but it remains alive in every retelling, a symbol of fear, of mystery, and of the human need to make sense of the dark.